Hi, welcome to Rule of Carnage. My name is Glenn Ford. In a minute, you're going to see me talking to Mike Hutchinson. We're a couple of games designers, and we're going to spend time on this channel talking about how to make better miniatures games. In this video, we're going to talk about what it is that we're going to talk about. Don't worry, it all makes sense in a minute. For now, Mike, would you be so good as to ask me a clearly pre-prepared question?
Games that we design that maybe have miniatures.
Yeah.
What are they, Glenn?
Well, that's very much what I thought would be a good idea to sort of form the body of the first of these, is to talk a bit about what sorts of games we're going to try and talk about, and maybe what sorts of games we aren't going to try and talk about. I mean, the thing that's interesting to me about this is that if you go to certain groups, certain conventions, certain forums, you don't need to put too much explaining into what you mean by a miniature skirmish game, for example. And it always used to be the fallback position is that I would say to people, oh, well, it's a miniature skirmish game, or it's a miniatures war game. Now, whether it's because of an increasing prevalence of mini heavy games coming through from various trends at the moment, it's becoming harder and harder to say to somebody who isn't a person who plays this sort of game, oh, it's a tabletop minis game, and have them understand what you mean. It's possibly something that is more bugs me than almost anybody else, but the fact that the fact that I can't just sort of explain what sort of game Gaslands is, or A Billion Suns is, or any of, you know, there are obviously tons of other games that we haven't personally worked on that fall into this category, whether it's from, you know, Warhammer, Malifaux, Warmachine, you know, through to something more independent like Frostgrave or Blast Days. There's a category of game where I know what I mean when I talk about it, and there's a whole group of people who don't know what I mean when I talk about it.
And to put a couple of examples on that, recently we've been playing. So we grew up on Necromunda and Mordheim. Recently we've been playing Gloomhaven and Deep Madness. And Gloomhaven and Deep Madness have miniatures, and they are fighting each other using combat resolution systems, and broadly speaking, just brawls that play out. But so yeah, but they're totally different, and I don't make Deep Madnesses. I make Necromundas, but I don't know. Yeah,
yeah. So I think there was Wildlands that came out recently. Now that's listed as a skirmish game. And it always used to be the easy, you know, offhand thing to say, okay, this is a skirmish game, and people knew what you meant. And now you've got a boxed skirmish game with a board in it, which definitively isn't, therefore, the sort of the category we're talking about. So we've been having a little bit of an email chat prior to this conversation about sort of, I think, interestingly, two slightly divergent positions on what the sort of game we're talking about is. So sorry, I'm going to need to cough here for a second. I'll open by making a suggestion of what I think defines this sort of game, and then I'm sure that Mike will have an almost exactly contrary opinion to it, and we'll talk about we'll argue pointlessly about the the different opinions. Now, to me, the sort of game that I'm talking about, I mean, a few times I call them unboxed games. I've referred to them as miniatures and measures, like miniatures and tape measures. And sometimes I talk about them as being analog games specifically. So I'll do those in reverse order. When I say an analog game, if we take, for example, Monopoly, just because it's a game that everybody knows extremely well. You can't move 1.5 spaces on Monopoly. You can't stop halfway between Go and Old Kent Road. you have to move a defined sort of, as it were, digital set of steps. Pretty much anything that has a board with marked spaces on it puts you into this place where you have a sort of a non-analog game that you're now playing. Conversely, something like A Billion Suns, for example, there is a literally infinite number of options that you have between point A and point B. In Gaslands, when you pivot a car, you have a literally infinite number of degrees available to you when you pivot that car. To me, that's why I call them analog games, because they are truly literally analog. There is an infinity of options when you play any of those games, in a way that there isn't in the whatever the other games we're talking about here are, boxed games, the games with boards.
Is X-Wing one of which? What is X-Wing then?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, yeah, X-Wing, because X-Wing does have a deployment phase in which you are relatively limited, but can put your ships anywhere within that deployment phase. At the same time, though, I remember reading an interview with one of the World Championship tournament winners of X-Wing, where he explained that he sat down and set out a series of sort of patterns for every ship in the game, and had pre-calculated everywhere that every ship could ever end up during a given game of X-Wing. He had actually taken X-Wing and broken it down into being a digital game. There comes a point where you can't go into certain places in X-Wing, no matter what you do. And so while I think that X-Wing fulfills a lot of the criteria of this sort of game, I think it's probably some sort of halfway point. And I think it's probably why X-Wing makes a good gateway game for that sort of game, because it gives you that kind of, okay, you've got a tabletop and you can put anything on the tabletop, but you don't have infinite freedom. You don't have to go, well, how far should I move? Any given degrees of movement are available to you. Pivot any amount. It does give you a little bit of a handholder there.
Yeah, I think that freedom, that lack of discrete locations, is definitely a turn off for a bunch of board gamers who are peering over at something like this. Like it, I've had conversations with people who've looked at something like that and gone, "What? You can just go wherever you like?" Nah, I don't know. I don't like it. It's weird.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, personally, as a designer, it's that for me is the thing that I find most interesting about designing these sorts of games, is the sort of the sort of infinite freedom that a player has, even on the simplest of moves, where they have total control over how far they move. And it's why these end up being sort of game systems a lot of the time rather than definitive games, is because I don't know where you will end up during one of these games. I don't know what set of situations you will be in. If I'm writing a set of rules for a board game, I know definitively you'll end up on this space or that space, and you'll have this card or that card. I can crunch down all of the possible results. If I'm designing one of these more analog games, I don't know what sort of terrain you've got in your collection. I don't know what sort of miniature you're using, and I will never know exactly how many millimeters you're moving across, or fractions of nanometers you're moving across the table. I will never know exactly how many degrees you're pivoting.
That sort of, there's probably a separate topic in that, which is that I've been wrestling with level design with A Billion Suns recently, and that is one of the things that I think it's fundamentally different between writing a scenario for a miniature skirmish game and designing a level or a dungeon in a board game. And in my recent attempts to sort of hybridize the two, I'm discovering some interesting problems there. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There's an analog spectrum of possibilities that means you have to approach the rules that you give the player in a slightly more not forgiving way, but like you just have to approach it differently. There's a different set of constraints you have to take into account.
And I think I think moving on from that, when I say I sometimes just describe them as minis and tape measure games, or minis and measures games, because those are the tape measure sort of suggests that analog nature of them, and I think it is the sort of thing that is a bit off-putting to people who aren't part of that end of the hobby. When you see people stood around a table with a tape measure measuring things, it feels a bit sort of a bit mathsy and a bit sort of science club, where it's like, well, this has a range of X amount. And it can be a bit off-putting to people, but it's just that it's that thing that notes the analog nature of it. And the minis side of it is, and I think, and this is something that possibly leans into where your sort of more into the definition of it is that there's something about these games that are about the collection of physical objects that you own in your collection, and you then sort of tip out onto the table. When we say miniatures, and I know that talking about in relation to miniatures independent games and games that aren't part of a specific range, but when we talk about miniatures, we talk about any given object that you choose to put onto your table and make part of your game. I'm not talking about sort of a range of necessarily molded figures that come with the game necessarily, or really have anything to do with it, but it's a game that defines what the book that you stack to be a hill in that particular playthrough ends up being. Today, that book is a miniature. It has certain rules to it, and I'll tell you what the rules are for it, so you can know how it interacts with your playing pieces. And whatever you choose to define as miniatures and tape measures within that phrase, to me, I think it's those two things come together to sort of to make a lot of these games sort of physically, whatever, conceptually, however you want to see it.
I think that one for me has a lot of truth in it, because I sort of came at this entire sort of world of games, miniature war games, from a model making perspective. So I had Airfix kits first and kind of fell in love with sticking my fingers together and painting things, and then discovered the world of miniature war games, where you could do the same activities, but then you could do it towards a specific game purpose. And the idea of building terrain and spotting scrap on the floor of on the roadside on your way home from school, and collecting these weird tubes and making pieces of industrial terrain out of them, like that is very, very much where my heart lies. And so the games that I write will probably always be ones where you can collect some junk from the side of the road and paint it as terrain for whatever setting it's purporting to be. And so that DIY nature of it, again, that's something that when we've been demoing the game at, for example, UK Games Expo, which is predominantly a sort of board and card game place, people are attracted to it, and then they sort of look skew-eyed at some of the DIY terrain that I've brought along, and they're like, wait, so you don't get this terrain in the box? Like, no, there's not even a box. So what do you make it? Yeah, you just come up with it, and you make it, and you paint it, and you just whatever, you invent it as you go along. It's a DIY system. And I think that in trying to get a bead on what it is that I'm particularly passionate about, and I think you are as well, there's a larger circle that's to do with hobby gaming and collecting, but also DIY. And then inside that is the sort of independent angle on that, which is it's still about DIY and hobby and having physical collections, and I think also that sphere of analogness. But because what I am doing particularly doesn't have any associated product line with it, then there's a sort of it's DIY, but it's DIY with everybody else's stuff, and I don't provide you anything. It's like the ultimate DIY. I'm not even going to give you a leg up. I'm just going to give you the sandbox to play in, but you have to bring your own sand.
I mean, yeah, it's one of the things I think that probably a certain amount of Gasland, particularly the success of Gaslands, owes itself to is the miniatures game that you've got the miniatures for anyway. You know, it's they're already out there, they're already available to people, and I think sort of starting to say that that's the sort of the third version of a definition that I've sometimes used in sort of various discussions about this sort of game is the difference between a boxed game and whatever these are unboxed games. And again, possibly running back to X-Wing, it's an interesting point where X-Wing is somewhere between the two, where with X-Wing you get 90% of what you need to play a game of X-Wing in a box of X-Wing, but you don't get everything because you don't get a board, you don't get a playmat in a box of X-Wing.
Yeah, the amount of creativity, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but the amount of creativity that you need to pour into the X-Wing components that you're sold in order to get a sensible game of X-Wing is quite small. You just unpack everything, and maybe you've got some expansions, maybe you don't. You unpack everything, you put on the table, and it broadly works. And I think that's very clever because it's a space game, so you can just have a flat table with some asteroids on. But when you open up a Games Workshop box, and I note they've been getting better and better and better at this, but like they've always had some buildings. And so given a table, you can crack everything out of the box and you can basically be ready on the morning of your birthday to play. And that, I think, is trying to get you over the hump of the fact that it's ultimately, like you say, it's an unboxed experience. It's an open door that says, do whatever you like, create the universe that you want on your tabletop using whatever skills you have, and enjoy the experience of making the things that you need to play the game, and then enjoy the experience of playing with your unique setup, and nobody else has this heap of garbage on their table, and you should be proud of that.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think it's been interesting, like say, going to conventions and things, because Gaslands is a very gateway miniatures game, and it's getting a lot of people who haven't played other versions of this sort of game, and to explain to and very often we have people come to us and say, okay, so where do I buy the terrain, where do I buy this, and where do I buy the other? And sometimes we'll sort of suggest one person or another, but by and large the answer is, I don't know. I mean, you know, where have you grabbed things from? You don't have to buy any of this if you don't want to. You can test it out with plant pots and you know, Jenga blocks and whatever it happens to be to hand that will physically stand on the tabletop and give you something to interact with. But you don't need to do any of this. None of this is a requirement for you to play the game.
But I think that comes out in the Gaslands community, but I think it's actually kind of critical for me, which is, if you are not excited by the idea that you can do what you like and build what you want and bring it to the game, then it's sort of like, I'm not writing it for you. Like, you know, we can both enjoy playing a different kind of game together, but in the realm of what I'm trying to write, like if you're not excited by the idea that you can take a toilet tube and paint it gray and now it's an industrial pipe, like it's kind of like, that's the heart of what I'm doing. So a lot of the game ideas that I have, they either come out of wanting to capture some excitement that I've had from some piece of media, like a film or a TV show or a video game, but quite often they're like, well, I really want to build and paint this, or you know, I want to have a centerpiece of that, and how would I have a game that makes having that hobby project a cool thing? You know, to a degree, you can even see it in some of the Gaslands refueled rules, like the reason that Rusty, one of the key reasons that Rusty exists as a sponsor, is that, you know, we discussed it at the time. I just wanted to throw down a gauntlet to be like, try building a team that's got a bunch of trailers. Like, that's actually not a super easy thing to do. It doesn't, you know, that you found some good ways of achieving it with caravans and stuff, but like it's something that, it's a little puzzle, but it's not a game puzzle, it's a modeling puzzle, it's a DIY puzzle.
That and a fantastic late night encounter at BonesCon with a brilliant fan who gave us the idea for Rusty during a marathon session that I think we flaked out on about 2 or 3 a.m. and left them playing with.
Yes, Pink Gin, Gaslands sponsors. So yeah, so that's what we write. We write things where fundamentally, it has to invite you into a DIY realm of model making, and I quite like the idea of collecting. Like, yeah, the idea, because there's a couple of interacting things that aren't necessarily cause and effect. They're a bit more complicated than that. You mentioned two already, which is one writes game systems because the system is analog and I can't know where you are. So those two things interact, but like I don't know if I had to write a game system because we already start with the assumption that we're analog, or like which way around that works. And the other thing I think is I write miniature agnostic rule systems because I don't have a product line. But I suppose I could have a product line and then I wouldn't write miniature agnostic things. I'd write things for that product line. I've just selected that as the approach. And that's, again, I think because I come from a land of hoarding miniatures from all over the places. And so I'm delighted by and excited by the idea that I'm excited by games that give me permission. Like Frostgrave, I think, was tremendously successful. One of the reasons it was tremendously successful is it was its permissive attitude to be like, yes, like D&D miniatures exist from 100 different manufacturers, bring them all together on the table and the system will accommodate them all. And I like systems like that, and I want to write systems like that that don't say you're going to have this and you're going to have that. They say, brilliant, bring the toys. What do you think spaceships look like?
Yeah, I mean, personally, the thing is, I'm not a sculptor. I'm not an artist. I'm not. If I did or could design amazing looking miniatures, then conceivably I would design an amazing looking miniature and then I would write a game for that amazing looking miniature, because that would then be my skill set. I don't have that particular capacity, and it's I suppose it's funny because this is one of the conversations that sort of come up peripherally on other things. Is Mike is a great modeler and a fantastic artist and loves painting and putting together miniatures. I don't like painting or putting together miniatures. I personally don't care whether or not I'm using them the same miniatures or not. Despite that fact, Mike finds it perpetually confusing that whenever I put together a force or an army in various game systems, they're heavily converted and messed around
always
with.
fully painted.
Well, yeah. I mean, you've got to have some self-respect about these things. But
I'll have one model that I'm like, yeah, this is the one that I can't finish the rest of the army, but I've got one that will, give me the self-respect I need.
Yeah, and I tend to heavily convert things up, and for me that's a conceptual thing, because it's like if I don't have an entire concept for the entire army and its entire meaning, then I can't be bothered with picking up army list 1. It has to be an entire sort of idea. And I think previously, Mike, you've talked about the fact that, I mean, to me at least privately, about the fact that you don't feel sort of moved towards doing those sort of boxed games. I mean, personally, what I tend to do is I have an idea for a game, a thing I want to get across, an experience I want to sort of give a gamer, or just an interesting intellectual puzzle that I want to fiddle with. And then I'll start writing it. And if the most efficient, most intelligent way of doing it is to give people a deck of cards and a board and some other stuff, then it's going to be a boxed game. If I can't justify making somebody buy a board or pick up a deck of cards, then it's going to be a skirmish game, more of a rule system. And sort of tying into what you're saying about sort of independent games versus boxed games, I know in your own sort of journey is a big word, but journey for sort of writing various games, was there ever a point where they were going to be a box game? I mean, we've talked about the Gaslands starter set, if that were ever to be a thing, once or twice in the past. Has there ever been a point where you've started writing a skirmish game and gone, this would just be so much more efficient if I gave people a board? This would be so much better if I just gave people some of those things where I don't have to set out a list of catch-all rules and then just let them go mad in the playground?
No, oddly not, and I don't know exactly why, but I think when I started like really kind of aggressively diving into games design 7 or 8 years ago and wanted to really push myself, I tried writing a lot of board games and like board and card games, and I just couldn't get they just didn't inspire the same level of creative satisfaction and passion in me, or I was crummy at it and didn't get sort of, you know, didn't get satisfaction from the things that I was making. But and the thing is, I love playing board games, but I think part of me is always sad when I'm playing a board game that I'm not actually playing a miniatures war game, because I think that's what I'd rather in my heart of hearts be doing. And that because of that, like when my brain is settling into okay, think about the warmest, happiest game design place you could go to, then I'm pushing little miniatures around that I've painted across, you know, little pieces of terrain that I've sculpted. And because that's where my passion truly is, like that's all I really want to do, is make more and better ones of those. That DIY-ness, that physicalness, that analogness, the fact that it's sort of like it's cinematic and theatrical in a way that something digital with squares kind of never is for me. As soon as there's a grid laid over it, like I don't negatively react to it from a pure games perspective. Like I don't mind those things, but they don't inspire the same like childlike glee for replicating a sort of, you know, a narrative that I sort of, you know, you read on a book and you want to push into little physical model making reality. And I think that's really it. Like I'm still so delighted by little tiny hills with flock spread all over them that just looks like a real thing, but it's teeny tiny, and then you get to blow each other up over the over the top of it. That's where ultimately, if I can't be making one of those, the game idea just gets shelved and it just ends up in my notebook as like, well, maybe there's a card game there, but I'm not going to work on it.
Okay, I mean, I don't know what the answer to this question is going to be. So, I mean, do you think that it's because those sorts of games, like, I mean, the Gaslands, I always think is a fantastically cinematic game. It's a very narrative game, despite being as free
Go
form.
boom! Good story.
Yes,
I'd rewatch that story.
I mean, it is though. You know, you
George
have
Miller made
your
a career out of it. It's fine.
you have your race, you have your leader, you have your back markers. You know that there's a set of stories there that you really know, and you can really, and it's surprisingly narrative given how completely freeform it is. Anything could happen. There's no. I think we said several times the number of games where the winner ends up upside down on fire midair going across the finish line. You would think that we had designed to that with some sort of level of skill that we do not possess. It needs to be made very clear. But it's incredibly narrative. Whereas I take for an example a game that, like Scotland Yard, and then we've been playing Fury of Dracula, etc., etc. The thing I personally love about, say, Scotland Yard is there's a player experience of what it's like being chased, and the tension, and the nervousness and the fear, and oh, they're this close to me. And for me, a lot of the time, those boxed games, because they're a bit more confined, you can put players in a certain space and put certain controls on them, you can get a specific sort of experience out of them that you can't necessarily get in those more analog games. And for me, a lot of the time, those more analog games are more effective when they are more narrative and less experience driven in the same, or at least less sort of less definitively experience driven. I mean, it's like I've
Yeah, because you put power in the hands of the players to totally ruin whatever experience you're trying to create. Whereas with a set of discrete actions that you can take and discrete spots that you can land on, then it's way more in your control. Although having said that, even in Scotland Lard, even in Scotty Lard, you could totally ruin the experience by just being a bad player who reveals their own location whilst they're moving around. So but like case in point, like as you were retelling Scotland Yard, I'm thinking, like in my mind I've painted, like I'm thinking, oh, wouldn't it be cool to find some little 28 mil sort of 20s policemen and then have MDF London streets with little LED bulbs, and like now we've got a line of sight game where, you know, I'm trying to hide from you and you've got a net of like, that's where my brain is immediately going from a games design point of view, because I want to be down at that street level with the teeny tiny street lamps and the little painted policemen. And I'm happy to play Scotland Yard any day of the week. It's a lovely, lovely game. And I wouldn't try and recreate exactly the same mechanical experience, but the emotional experience of I'm being chased, I've got to run, oh no, I've just squeaked past. Like, I think you could achieve that with miniatures. In a way, Infinity achieves some elements of that. Like, it's quite nerve-wracking to move around the board in Infinity. So you could maybe try and do that. But yeah, in terms of like what kind of games am I writing, that's the way that I'm translating it. And it's interesting that I think the breadth of your output format wise, I think speaks to the fact that you are not forcing ideas into, you're not rejecting ideas based on format, you're finding the format that the idea fits. Whereas for whatever reason, I am rejecting ideas that don't fit the teeny tiny policeman format.
I mean, for me, the two great sort of game design challenges I always think are comedy and horror, because they're inherently extremely difficult to give people in a free form format, as it were. It's like if you give someone a joke and take, for example, a game like say Munchkins. It's got loads of great puns on the cards and they're funny the first time you read those puns. Inherently, though, any fun you get out of the game on your second, third or fourth play is not down to the puns anymore, because you've read them. You know, you got the joke first time. It's not funny because of them. Whereas you take, say, I don't know, a game like Twister, you always laugh playing a game of Twister, even though it's not making any jokes. And and it's a similar thing for horror games. There are a lot of games that show you a horrible image or say a horrible phrase or describe a horrible thing. There are very few games that make you afraid in the mechanics of the game, give you a horror experience on the fourth time of playing the same scenario through. And for me, I'm constantly sort of fiddling of ways of trying to do. I want to make an analog unboxed miniatures game that's a comedy game where something happens every game where one miniature moves past another miniature and it's inherently funny that occurred. I have no idea. I've got a version of a thing which is like a fast game and everyone's running around and trying to avoid each other, but it's not fun, you know.
I mean, it totally depends on the players and what occurs, but I do think that Gaslands has a lot of inherent physical comedy in it, because
there's a lot of slapstick.
Well, yeah, because like the selection of the templates creates a moment where you can go, ha ha, I totally messed that up, and the skid dice create a moment where you can go, oh my goodness, I've just spun off here, and the wiping out, like, because there's a lot of unpredictability in where things land. Adding enough unpredictability ends up creating situations which are funny or unexpected, and so people can laugh about together. Because I think that, you know, in most miniature games, you're looking for miniature skirmish, tabletop, world, DIY, hobby, collecting games. You're looking for that moment which is emergent from the gameplay, which is worth talking about after the game. And you know, in a classic like Warhammer, it's the fact that you can always wound on sixes, and so there's an opportunity for, you know, the horse to kick the vampire lord's teeth in, and for that to be noteworthy by the end of the game. But I think that you're right, like deliberately writing in, because as you were talking about that, like the thing that this is probably not true, because after you played it more than I perhaps have, it stops being funny. But a game like Paranoia, the RPG, which gives you a set of inherently ludicrous language that you have to communicate through, like that, at least from a tabletop RPG point, creates something inherently funny. Like it's very difficult to not be chuckling as you're trying to navigate the ridiculous constraints that they place on the language in front of the table. And weirdly, we always laugh as a family playing
This is Shadows of a Camelot.
yeah, Shadows over Camelot, because it says something in the rule book about how you're not allowed to reveal your information. And there's a number of games that do this, and there's always a bunch of head scratching on Board Game Geek about like why and is this enforceable and what happens if you don't. But the point being that rule at least creates a situation where my dear departed father-in-law would always talk in hey nonny noo faux medieval, and we would all fall about trying to and so I think that successful comedy games are placing tools in the hands of the players that make it easier for them to be funny in front of their friends. And I don't know how much to do with miniature skirmish games that has, because if you're playing a social card game or a deduction game, like it's like that's the medium, that's the actual string connecting the components of the game is our voices, and the same is true of tabletop role-playing games. But yeah, like Gaslands isn't like that. It's just funny because it's got a sort of Charlie Chaplin slapstick comedy to it. So I think that's you probably have to do a physical comedy thing rather than
I mean, yeah, I guess I suppose the point is generally in relation to why you would write this sort of game, or why we write these sorts of games. For me, it's about trying to see if, as I say, a lot of the time for games for me, it's about trying to see if I can give the player, either it's about giving the player a certain given experience, and is that achievable at a tabletop. I want people to laugh. I want people to, if they want to, feel scared. Can I do that to someone? Can I give them a set of rules and go, get your mate around the table, follow these rules, and then at some point you will actually have the feeling of watching a horror movie, not because I've hidden a scary picture on page 34, but because your friend is stalking you and you don't know how to react to it, and you get more paranoid or more twitchy or any of those sorts of things. Or the other things that often motivates me to write or design a game is when a little sort of intellectual thing pops up where you go, if I do that to them, that will mean that they'll click through and the clockwork will kick in, and then that'll make them want to do that, and that'll make them want to do that, and then at some point down the line they'll be sit in a situation, they'll look at it and go, oh, that was very clever. I mean, Moonflight, my second Kickstarter, early on when I was sort of play testing it and sort of demoing it at UKGE, there were a couple who came over who were big deck builder fans, and they were playing it, and there was a bit that really warmed my heart sort of halfway through the game, where the chap in the couple was playing it and just going, oh, that's very clever, oh no, I see and then a couple of turns later he was going, oh no, I see. No, I see. Oh no, that's very clever. And sort of intervals throughout the game.
Go, yes.
He would. It's like, I don't know whether he enjoyed it, but he was impressed by the intelligence of it throughout. And it's like every 15 minutes he'd have this moment where he'd go, oh, now I see what you've done. Now I see, and just being able to sometimes. If you can, one of the most fun games to play is designing games from an intellectual standpoint, just a fun standpoint.
Yeah, that is a good hobby.
And when you find a series of problems and you fix all those problems and they click together, and then you give the game to somebody else and they get to experience the same set of problems in the same way and get the same satisfaction. That's the other thing I personally really love about designing games. It's where you can go, okay, there are sweeties buried somewhere
Is,
within
is,
this.
is that a um, is that a connoisseurs offering? Like, is that something that only works if people understand deck builders, they get something out of that deck builder design? If they only by understanding miniature skirmishes games do they gather some of that additional juice that you've played? Like, is that an important consideration? Or
I
are
mean,
those two kinds of games? You might design something that is just easy for entry level and something that is grognardian and has
I
delicious
suppose
olives in it that you have to have a taste for before you can enjoy.
there's a Simpsons episode where the various characters have to teach the school, and Professor Frink is teaching the kindergartners with a little push along motor thing that pops up little balls, and he's explaining how the random oscillation of particles. And one of the kindergartners is asked to play with it. He says, "No, you won't enjoy it on as many levels as I do." And there's the thing. It's like the game is perfectly fun and works and is great if you've never played, another game of that type.
Mhm.
But if you have, you will have the opportunity to enjoy it on other levels.
Mhm.
It's like I say, I mean, I believe, obviously, because I made it, I think that Moonflight is a good solid intro deck builder. Works fine if you've never played another deck builder. It's very self-contained. But if you are deck builder literate, you'll get to see how clever I was, which may or may not matter to anybody. And you'll have moments where you go, I see the background of education, the sort of game literacy that person has. And if you're not aware of it, it's like watching a movie where the director does something where if you are movie literate, you can go, I see the reference he laid in there, and you get a little extra piece of squishy juice out of it. But if you're not that movie literate, the movie doesn't fall apart because you didn't spot, that movie poster is a reference to The Hills Have Eyes or something. It works just fine.
So
Um,
maybe that leads to probably what should be the final question for this conversation. So in terms of the games that we design, by which I mean the games that we choose to invest our time in. So we have a bunch of ideas, they hit the notepad, and some of them get discarded and we don't work on, and some of them get excited and we bother pouring hours and hours of our life into. For you, is it important that it be novel or innovative? Like, does it have to be doing something different because otherwise you're just doing the same thing as everyone else? Or are you happy with the idea that Hamlet has already been staged? I'm going to stage Hamlet, and it's going to be mostly the same, but it's going to be my version of Hamlet. It's going to have something different about it. Like, do you have a visceral reaction in one way or the other?
I mean, pretty definitively for me, it has to be the first one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with, sort of, yeah, restaging Hamlet, but I guess what it comes down to is I'm not confident maybe that I'm that smart to do the best. It's like if there are 10 versions of something, I'm not inherently confident that I'm going to make the best version of it. I mean, it feels a little hubristic to go, yeah, there's 100 versions of this, but you know
Right.
which is going to be the
So
best one?
a science fiction gang skirmish game with a progression system. There's a few of those. You'd have to
Yeah,
really do something spectacular to be the most noteworthy,
yeah. Whereas if
without
I can,
innovating greatly into something different.
yeah, whereas if I can do something unique is pretty tough, but if I can do something genuinely special, unusual, something that I'm fairly confident hasn't popped up before, then I think I can offer something else. I mean, on a more conceptual sort of end of it, and this is something that I know probably we might end up talking about at some point in the future. I don't want to go into too heavily at the moment. Is that I personally feel like board games, boxed games, are going through a renaissance on so many levels at the moment.
Hmm.
There are some games out there that, Holding On, The Tragic Life of Billy Kerr. I don't know if you've come across it. It's a game about a guy who is dying of a terminal disease, and you have to sort of tease out of him the stories of his life to give him a sort of easier death at the end of it. And it's so sort of it's a story that's so heavy and deep and weird and so far removed from what you might imagine if you only know sort of quite mainstream board games, that I can fairly confidently say that if you don't think you like board games, I can find one that I think might change your mind.
Mm.
For me, I want to see that kind of movement in the the side of hobby we're talking about, these more sort of analog games. I personally, and it maybe it's just my sort of, you know,
Your white
fo-
whale.
my foolish quest. I want to there to be a place where people can get completely different stories out of those kinds of games from anything that we previously had. I want to be able to have, because at the moment I feel like by and large, if someone says they don't like that kind of game and they know well enough to make to voice that opinion, I kind of had to say, yeah, you probably don't then. If somebody says they don't like board games, I say I'm pretty confident I can find one that you will like.
Yeah,
If
that's so
someone says
interesting.
they don't like these kinds of games, I'm not entirely confident that I'll be able to find one that where I'll be able to say, see, at least this one maybe you like. And that's one of the reasons I want to do games that are more, whatever, more unique isn't, m- more unusual,
Just
is
less about goblins and Star Wars things.
well, just to try and find that experience or that version of the game to
Mm.
give somebody to say, okay, this is something different, this is something unusual, this is an area of the hobby that can be more than, and I'm more than again is pejorative, and I don't like that, but at least wider,
Different to
at least
additional,
different to
additionally.
what it currently is. And it's not that traditional war games aren't completely fantastic, but they are there. They do exist, and there are brilliant ones out there. There isn't necessarily a version of this game which is, Jane Austen, and you've got to sort of track down, Mr. Bennett and catch him in a corner and give him a love letter from, which you could do in a skirmish game. It's not inherently a reason you couldn't. Um, and I want to see those games. I want to see that kind of diversity in a hobby that I love, and I want to see different experiences given to players through engaging with a hobby I love.
Mm.
So yeah, I mean, if it's going to be the sort of the final question, what about you? How do you feel about that version of? Is there something to bring special and different by retelling that previous story in a way with another spin on it and a personal take, or do you have to bring something that people are gonna knock their socks off and drop their jaws and go, oh, I did not believe you could do that?
I mean, I know what the answer is, and it's kind of funny from the outside because like, although there wasn't that many car combat games, like car combat games are a thing. There was a big hairy Car Wars shaped player that I was coming up against, and there's plenty more besides that. And then making a spaceship game, like there's a ton of spaceship games. Maybe there hasn't been that many like big ticket spaceship games recently, but Drop Fleet Commander was pretty big splash and so on. So in many regards, like I'm not at all concerned with or rejecting ideas because they fit into an established genre. I like that kind of those kind of skirmish game genres already. I'm happy with them. But what will cause me to reject an idea for a game is if I cannot find or haven't yet discovered the technology innovation in it. So what's super interesting is that you're talking about um, subject matter innovation or narrative innovation. Like, where can you push a game subject matter to create spaces that game design spaces, play experience spaces that haven't existed? And I suppose I'm most delighted by the technology of games, and I like using the word technology because it sort of, for me, it accurately describes the demand that I have on my own designs, which is, if a solution to a problem already exists, I'm going to start by rejecting the existing solution and see if a better solution exists. And I will try 10 different solutions, and most of them will be horrible. And then I'll land on something which I find is totally delightful. And that, I think, is what I'm looking for, like for Gaslands and for A Billion Suns. There's plenty of innovative areas in that, and people sit up and they go, wow, it's a spaceship game, that sounds boring, I know what spaceship games do, and then they look at it and go, crumbs, I've not seen anything that does any of this rubbish, what is this? And so the technology innovation then hooks into a second thing which is really important to me, which is like, what is the player experience like? And this I think is very, very adjacent to what you're talking about, but coming from a different place, which is, if I can already, using the same rules or different rules, have the same sort of experience tactically, logically, mathematically, tactilely, model makingly, like, what's the point in writing another game that feels the same to play, even if the mechanics are different? And it's why you and I have spoken at length about, there's a sort of we'll just go out ahead and say it, there's like a lower tier of skirmish games which you open them, you read them, and the mechanics add up to an experience that you've already had with 6 other games previously. And for that, I'm like, well, I'm not going to bother playing this because there's nothing for me to discover here. I can imagine already what the cognitive and emotional experience of playing this game will be, because I know it. I've played it 3 times already, just with a different letterhead on the top of it. So I'm looking for things which push the players into places that they never had to think about. So, for Gaslands, the idea that you need to constantly get more and more overexcited in order to have further and further activations in the game. In order, like in A Billion Suns, the idea that you don't have any units on the table and you make a decision moment by moment about what you're going to bring out. These are like technology innovations in the player experience. And if it doesn't have a technology innovation in the player experience, I'm probably just going to keep it in my notebook.
Cool. Right, that's been a plenty long conversation. I'm fairly confident we could ramble on about that sort of thing for another hour or two.
Well, let's call that episode 1, and we'll come back.
Yeah. There's a limit to the resistance people will have for this sort of thing.
If you've made it this far, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. If you have watched along with this, we'll, as I say, we'll try and post it up both as a podcast and a video on YouTube. I believe we're going to be featured somewhere in Tabletop Gaming's spring showcase of videos. I don't know if this specific video will go in it or it'll be one of the later ones, but if you're watching us because of that, thank you for sticking with us. There will be videos ongoing, and we'll see just how long we can maintain this for, and how much interest there is in it. But for now,
always the bubbling, enthusiastic MC.
Well, I mean, that'd
be great. We'll see you at the next episode. Okay,
bye. You've met me. if that's what you're expecting, this is the wrong place for that. We'll hope, people will be fascinated by this. We'll see what the response will be. If you do watch this, if you have a question for either of us, if you've got something that you would like to see somebody who has written a full game and put it out answer as a question, put it in the comments. There'll be, wherever this is, there'll be comments. Please ask us questions. Tell us what you would like to see us talk about. Be as specific as you like or as general, and we'll get to it and we'll address it, and hopefully we might be some sort of help. But until the next video, until the next cast, thanks for your time, Mike, and it's been brilliant as always, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.